What's up, everybody? My name is Michael Burrell, and in this video, I'm going to be going over the 4 different ways to work with gradients in Adobe Illustrator, specifically Illustrator CC 2019, including the new freeform gradient. Let's get started. All right, so I have a new file open. Doesn't really matter what size it is. I'm going to just grab a shape to draw in. So here's my rectangle. And now to work with gradients, I'm going to go up to Window and choose my gradient panel if I don't already see it on the side, which I don't. You may. Here's my gradients panel. A lot of people will dock this in the side. I could put this underneath my color and my swatches. I don't like to do that, and the reason for that is these are flyout menus. So when gradient is here, if I need to, and you'll see in a minute, often use swatches and gradient at the same time. I don't like that one collapses. If anything, I will put it down here, kind of tucked away at the bottom, or just leave it out to the side. But again, that can go wherever you're comfortable. So I have a shape selected. I'll pop open my swatches panel as well. And if you have the default swatches here, you may have a couple gradients already available. If you don't, we did talk in the last video about how you can pull out different libraries, or in this particular case, you can just go down and choose the gradient tool. If you choose this, or you choose a gradient from the swatches panel, and it's not working, one of the reasons maybe why is you can actually apply a gradient to a stroke as well. You may be, in fact, putting your gradient there and not see anything change. So make sure that the fill is in front, not the stroke. Remember, whichever one is in front is what it's applying to. So go ahead and click on that gradient. And now I have this white to black gradient, and we'll talk about the panel itself. So our gradient panel has this bar down here and these, which are called color stoppers. So my gradient slider will show white and black, and the diamond is the midpoint or the transition point. So if it's closer to the white side, I'll notice that it's much more black on my shape than white, or vice versa. And we can add as many points into this as we want. All we have to do to add a point is put our cursor just below it and click. That'll sample the color that's there already. You can see each one of these progressively got darker. So to remove one of these color stoppers, all we have to do is pull it away from the slider and it will disappear. We could also add colors from our swatches palette or a color palette. We can drag colors down, and this will give us any sort of gradient we can want to work with. We can also mess with transparency or opacity. So I can lower the opacity on a color, and if I move this out to the gray, you can see that this becomes less opaque and then more opaque, so we can see through. So you can play with the transparency levels of these color stoppers as well. Now this is a linear gradient. This goes from side to side, either left to right, top to bottom. The way we can control that with this angle right here. So we can, you can use your up arrow, you can choose one. I'm going to use my up arrow, but I'm going to hold shift while doing it. And that jumps up by tens, right? And I can rotate this around. We also have this inverse button or swap, so it reverses the order. So instead of black to white, it's white to black, vice versa. So these are some of the options that we can play around with a linear gradient. Now we can edit gradient, and there's 2 ways to do this. We can either choose the gradient tool in our toolbar, which will do that, or edit gradient will do the same thing. And now I can see the same gradient slider, but it's on the shape, which makes it a little easier for people to sometimes visualize how it's going to look or exactly where they want something. So you might know that you want the red, the green, and the blue very, very close together. And so I can just drag them that way. And then maybe click on here and decide that that should be white instead, so it's white on both sides. All right, so we can play around here. Now I could also just grab my gradient tool and just drag, and it'll draw my gradient in the direction that I've dragged in. So these are, again, linear gradients. Now another type of gradient we have is a radial gradient. Same idea, but it goes in a circle, so you'll see it repeating because it's doing it both sides. Some of the other options we have here is we can change the aspect ratio. So if I were to shrink down or enlarge the aspect ratio, I could stretch out or condense down my gradient, and then I could work with angle and rotate that around. Same thing with this one. I can edit my gradient by grabbing my gradient tool, just clicking and dragging, and I can draw out where I would want this. Also doesn't have to be centered in here, so we can start to draw from one side. So you can get a lot of different looks and effects and things like that. All right, so these are, again, radial gradients. Now, either a radial gradient or a linear gradient can also be applied to a stroke. So if I were to make this shape white rectangle, black stroke, and I enlarge the stroke a bit so we can see it easier, and I apply that gradient instead to the stroke, I can see a few different ways that this can be applied. First way is just across the stroke. So we have it where it's going throughout the whole shape, right? The whole shape is blue, then white, then red, top to bottom. That's this right here within the stroke. The next one is along the stroke, meaning that my stroke actually starts blue, goes white, red, green, all the way around. The third is a cross stroke, which is the whole thing within the shape of the stroke, right? And you can do this with radial as well. I'm going to delete this shape for a moment. The third type of gradient we don't really use much of anymore, and I'm going to draw out a new rectangle, make it black and white, and I'm going to hit this button down here, which is my mesh tool. You could also hit the letter U if you don't see it. And this is my gradient mesh. So the way this worked is you'd click in one spot, and this would leave an anchor point that you could now designate a color. So I'll grab my white arrow, I'll select that anchor point, make sure I have my fill in front, and I'll choose that. Now I click another spot, and I say that one should be yellow. And another spot, and I say red, and another spot, and I say blue. And you can see how this might get a little cumbersome to try to color everything. If I wanted this dark green on all the edges, I have to put it in multiple spots. This was never the easiest thing to work with. There were some nice ideas behind it. We could kind of start to bend and warp these, but it didn't really work in the most ideal way. So we've sort of gotten away from this now. So I'm going to delete this. And I wouldn't worry too much about that one unless you're going for something that's really realistic and you're in a situation where you need to use that, because as of CC 2019, we have something new. In CC 2019, they introduced this box here, which is our freeform gradient. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Freeform gradient gives us these control dots. These are our color stoppers. We can click and move them around. We can double click and add a new color to them or modify their color through the color palette. We can control how much influence they have on the area around them by making this outer circle bigger or smaller. And we could add more of these if we'd like, or delete them by just selecting it and hitting delete. So these are by points. We can also use something called lines. So I'll grab a ellipse to do that. So here's my ellipse, and hit my freeform gradient. And now what I can do is I can click this button here, line. And I can click a point, and then click another point, and it will start to round out and kind of arc in the same way that the curvature tool works. Now, if I decide I'm done, I don't want to connect these, I can just hit the escape key, and that'll discontinue that line. And now I can go in here with my tool, and I can give these different colors. So I can apply colors to these different points. And let me just grab a darker color for down here. When I click off, I can start to see I have a bit of flexibility as far as how those colors connect to each other. And now I can start to maneuver them around. Again, a bit more control now than I would have before. All right, so this is the freeform gradient. This allows us to do a lot of stuff we would not have been able to do in the past. Kind of S-shaped curves, things like that, that can let your gradient flow in a much more natural way. It's a little easier to work with than the gradient mesh tool was. Now, one thing I forgot to mention before is if you have your gradient tool and you have either a linear or a radial gradient that you happen to really like, you can grab this thumbnail and just drag it to your swatches and save it to this file so that you can later apply it to other objects. So those are the 4 ways you can work with gradients in Illustrator: linear gradients, radial gradients, gradient mesh, and the freeform gradient as of CC 2019. Hopefully you guys learned something there and now can start applying gradients to your artwork. In the next video, I'm going to be going over the transform menu and how we can take advantage and utilize that to improve our workflow. So make sure if that's something you're not familiar with, you tune in and check that one out, and I will see you guys next time.